And I will mute myself and it's over to you.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I just maybe some housekeeping. You may hear some screaming, crying, yelling in my home. I've got adult children. My partner and nieces and nephews currently watching the final game. So and England has scored. So there's some heartfelt tears. So I've asked them to be quiet, but there's that. I'm sure they won't be. So very excited to be here. My name's Siham Elkassem. I'm a clinical social worker, a therapist living here in London, Ontario, on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron people. I'm an actively engaged Muslim community member, anti-racist activist and academic. My clinical practice is focused heavily on critical race approaches and anti-racist approaches. I do, narrative therapy, CBT, DBT. I've got a private practice right now and pretty busy, I think, like most folks. And it's been strictly online and Zoom, and getting to know this virtual world has certainly been an adjustment. I'm also doing my PhD, and my focus is on anti-Muslim racism, Islamophobia, specifically in the context of Muslim youth. And I'm working from a critical race and anti-colonial theories. So I'm really happy to be here and share with you a study that I conducted with my great friend and colleague, Dr. Rick Cernick, who's in the space right now. Hey, Rick. And it was quite an eye-opening exploratory study that we conducted here in London, Ontario. And we called it Gatekeepers' Perspectives on Substance Use and Abuse. Just trying to. All right. So we'll tell you a little bit about the setting. There are, right now, according to the last statistics that were done here in Canada, there's over 1 million folks in Canada who identify as Muslim. That's about 3.2% of the nation's total population. The Muslim population is certainly growing at an exceeding rate. There's 350,000 Muslims in Ontario, almost 1 in 20 in London identify as Muslim. I think the last number we have is 30,000. That was in 2011. I'm sure certainly that has increased. 4%, I believe, of the population in London represent Muslims, and Muslims are from a diversity of cultural backgrounds. Algeria, I listed a few here. I'm sure folks would get upset because there's probably quite a few that are not listed. Afghanistan, Egypt, Libya, Lebanon, Eritrea, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan. We do know that according to the history in Canada, and we're still trying to uncover, I think, when Muslims first arrived, but I believe they came through the transatlantic slave trade as early as the 1700s. My husband, for example's family came in the early 1900s. They came from Lebanon. So it's very interesting when we talk about Muslims, as it would be interesting if you talked about Christians, right? It's a large segment of the world's population. So they do have a long history here in Canada. So, this is certainly an interesting topic to discuss, especially when it comes to Muslim populations. Within the Islamic faith, alcohol and drug use is actively discouraged, and it's deemed haram, which is an Islamic term, a derivative of Arabic that means forbidden. Thus, the use of illicit psychoactive drugs remains intensely secretive among Muslim community members. So for most populations, we know that stigma around substance use and misuse is certainly a barrier, and it does impede, folks accessing the help that they need. The few studies that do exist on Muslims, specifically in North America, reveal that psychoactive drug use is really, really problematic amongst Muslim youth. There is certainly an underrepresentation amongst Muslims in substance treatment programs. Research in the process of seeking treatment, oppression, language, and culture are additional barriers. I would also say oppression, specifically anti-Muslim racism and Islamophobia. I know that anecdotally with my own private practice, I have a few clients who do struggle with substance use and abuse and have a really, really hard time in traditional substance use programs, treatment programs. So this study examined gatekeepers' perspectives on substance use, and within specifically here in the community in London, Ontario. It was supported by the Ontario Association of Social Workers. They gave us a small research grant, and we're very thankful for that. So I invited trusted leaders, professionals who identified as being both community members, part of the Muslim, kind of group in the city, and we describe them as gatekeepers. So there are certainly people who folks go to regularly, in terms of reaching out and asking for help. But many of these were teachers, healthcare providers, counselors, professionals, and police officers. I think that the reason why a lot of people go to them is because there's certainly a mandate around confidentiality. And so people may feel safe to go to them, but that certainly doesn't mean that everyone goes to them. So this was a community-based participatory action research. So what we did before we engaged in the study, we connected with as many faith institutions as possible in the city, the mosques. We have a Muslim Resource Center for Social Support and Integration. We got some community letters and supports when we applied for the ethics for this study. So we really wanted to engage them because we do value their opinions as gatekeepers, as elders, folks that people go to. They have certainly a lot of knowledge, and we wanted to really honor some of the cultural diversities of cultures and religious beliefs amongst the people in the population. Oh, my findings are gone. Well, I'll tell you what the findings are. There were three major findings. The first was the impact of faith, the role of family and community, and then certainly challenges in seeking help. Oh, there it is. Sorry. Impact of faith, the role of family and community, and challenges in seeking help. The impact of faith. So the respondents did agree that the key organizing principle regarding addiction issues within the Muslim faith derives from the guidance of the Quran, which is the holy book. The Sunnah means the prophetic tradition. So these are like some of the sayings or the things that the Prophet Muhammad would do, how he would engage with the community, how he would engage with others. And Muslims are asked to sort of, replicate that in their daily lives. So this is really crucial understanding of how Islam serves as a protective factor, as the principles of Islam call for forgiveness, support, and mercy towards all individuals. We did find that there was not a uniform interpretation of how those who follow Islam should respond to the issues associated with drug use. The interpretation of these teachings, combined with varied cultural beliefs, has also fueled sort of stigma and shame within segments of the Muslim community towards those who use psychoactive agents, acting as a deterrent from seeking help, both peer and professional. This dichotomy reflects the heterogeneity of Muslim communities and the varied understandings of faith and the influence of culture, of course, right? Because we're talking about people who are first, second, third generation, some people who have come from Africa, West Africa, East Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, parts of Europe. So they come with sort of a mix of there's these Islamic faith traditions, but also there are some cultural components that impact whether it is, how they respond to this particular issue. These were some of the exemplars that were shared by some of the folks that were in the focus group discussions. One person said, when I was younger, which I'm sure is the same story for youth today, we're told things are either halal or haram. That means either forbidden or not forbidden or okay to do. So forbidden or permissible, right? But we also are taught everything that is forbidden is something that is desired. There's always a voice there when I was growing up. Well, you can't do this, alcohol is haram, cannabis to be used is haram, right? Weed is haram. So there's always that voice, but there's always that struggle because everybody else was doing it. I can tell you that, I'm born and raised in Chicago, and I felt the same way growing up in the city of Chicago in the 90s. Smoking marijuana wasn't as prevalent back then as it is now. I have adult children, and they're certainly, they come up against those issues as well on the day-to-day. And I think marijuana is certainly not one of the issues. There are folks that use it recreationally. I think the concern is obviously we're here over the weekend talking about the opioid epidemic. So there are other things that are of concern. Islam by itself, Christianity on its own, this is another person, Judaism on its own, Islam on its own, to fix a problem can't happen. So whether you're physically, emotionally, psychologically not doing well, whether it's addiction, whether it's mental health, whether it's, you broke your bone, you can't just go and say you're going to get better. Another person said, for some people, the protective factor is religion, and for other people, it's not enough of a protective factor. So it doesn't stop them from using. 100% true. I think a lot of folks would agree with that, regardless of what faith community come from. The influence of family and community, the second theme that came up. Within collectivist Muslim populations, the welfare of the individual, family, and community are often linked. I would say, if I was going to generalize about Muslim populations across the globe, many of them do come from collectivist backgrounds, and I do sort of see this theme amongst them. Again, I can't say that that's true for 1.8 billion Muslims, but the ones that I've come across from within multiple, backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, this is certainly a truth. Muslims with addiction issues are not in a position to seek help because of, I'm having some problems. The prominence of the shame and stigma that play within families in the community. That is certainly something that has come up quite a bit. There is a really, really good Vice documentary that was conducted in Dearborn. For those of you who are interested in that particular community, they talked about this regularly, that stigma and shame does play a role. And then there was a distinct dichotomy reported by participants in this particular study. Some people reported that family and community were a major source of strength and support, whereas other families were, talked a lot about feelings of denial, rejection, and fear and judgment from within their own community. Here is an exemplar. The approach taken by most Muslim parents, I find, is one where this is like unheard of and don't even talk to me about it. It's a horrible thing. This is something that one gatekeeper said here in London, Ontario, in that Vice documentary in Dearborn. That was prevalent, that people talked about that quite often. I also, as I had mentioned, I'm from Chicago. I have some contacts there as well within that community. That's also a prevalent theme. I don't see people necessarily wanting to see it, drug use, existing in our community or even acknowledging it. Another person said there's an honor/ego perspective within the community, right? It's if someone is going through something automatic, we look at the family, we want to hide, we want to sweep things under the carpet, secrecy. How is this? How are other people going to look at us? If they find out my son, my daughter, I'm this and that. It's interesting because it's how people within the Muslim community are thinking about how other Muslims, like the entire Muslim population, basically, I think is what they're saying, are looking at them. This person talked about, the protective factors around family and community, just friends, having family support. The more positive things would be, of course, turning to religion. I would say friends. From my experience, from what I've seen, it's retreating back towards your family and back towards your friends. I think one of the most negative ones is ignoring it and covering up and denying it. There's also another very interesting video that came out of Minnesota. And in Minnesota, there's a very large Somali population community. They're Somali, they're Muslim. So they talked a lot about one particular issue was that, females who were engaged in substance use and were struggling with addictions, there was this constant message of, you'll never get married, you'll never find someone in your life. And there's a certain struggle there. And I've heard themes of that as well here in London. Barriers to seeking help was also the theme, one of the themes that came up. Seeking help for addictions issues has historically been difficult, regardless of one's faith and ethnicity. While many groups face barriers in accessing treatment, a few face as many challenges as those within the Muslim community across, according to the 20 key informants in the study. This is because not only the way drug use is interpreted by those within the community, but also because of the lack of education, difficulty accessing mainstream services, Many of the gatekeepers indicated there are few community members who would access existing addiction services and mutual aid groups, even when anonymity was promoted. In addition to the lack of outreach by traditional addictions agencies to the Muslim community, there's a concern amongst study participants that counselors from mainstream agencies didn't understand the diversity of culture or religious variances amongst those who do identify as adhering to Islamic beliefs, as well traditional resources such as the imam or services. Imam would be a faith leader in the mosque, or services provided through local mosque or Muslim-specific counseling resources have not been developed to respond to the needs of Muslims with addictions issues. And there's no funding. I mean, many of us probably talked about that, right? There's no funding. Even if you did develop a program, it's very hard to get the funding for that, programming, especially in non-for-profit agencies who are smaller, specifically servicing Muslim groups. Funding usually goes to the bigger agencies, as well as traditional resources. There's also a legitimate concern that counselors from mainstream agencies don't understand Islam and do not know how to comprehensively work with Muslim clients. I'll also add, since then, again, just in terms of what's going on in the world, Islamophobia is a huge problem, whether it's implicit or even explicit. So folks often don't engage in services because they do experience that on a regular basis. Here are some of the exemplars. This is what some of the respondents said. In the years that I've been here, I think very few sessions about the topic have been addressed in the community in general. Absolutely. We are currently, we've presented the information to some of the faith institutions and faith leaders. It's definitely something that they're thinking about. I think in light of the recent terrorist events here in London, not that this is sort of taken a back seat, but it is this aside, along with other things, we're definitely needing to work hard to address some of the issues. The religious institutions, again, not equipped with counseling methodology. Certainly, a lot of the imams and faith leaders have recognized that. There have been quite a few studies, a few out of the Muslim mental health journal. You'll find that journal in the United States. There have been a few articles where imams were interviewed, and they have, they do understand that they don't understand how to respond adequately to issues around substance use and abuse. So this was actually an imam that said this. So when they come to me, I'm not trained to be a counselor. I can give religious advice. I can give religious guidance overall, which is general advice. 1 meeting, 2 meetings, but it doesn't really change the situation. Another person said we have to stop making imams and specialists in counseling and helping substance abusers. They're not trained for that. I've gone with some people, a couple of men who are alcoholics, going to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and they really don't fit in, right? Because a lot of it is their Christian prayers, they're part of this whole process. It makes it very hard to kind of fit in or kind of feel understood, aside from the fact they're probably populated by a lot of mainstream community people with potentially issues around, Islamophobia. What's interesting about these exemplars, and you may actually notice, is some of the language that's being used. Most of the folks that we interviewed were not people who engage regularly, in terms of therapy with people who are struggling. So you'll see words like alcoholics or substance abusers. I mean, even the language was hard to read, but I understand that this just tells me there needs to be more education within the community as well. So there are some recommendations. Education and the development of a uniform and holistic understanding of what substance misuse entails, how it should be addressed within the Muslim community. This requires direct education through mosques, Muslim community centers, Islamic school settings, taking into consideration the different interpretations of Islam that is held. As part of the education, issues of stigma, shame, and denial need to be included, with a consideration given to differences between first, second, third generation Muslim families from culturally diverse backgrounds. And so that is, complicated and actually really important to focus in on a little bit. First generation folks who come from, certain parts of the, let's say, Middle East, West and East Africa, like my parents, they came in the 60s. They were working really hard just to make money and to put us through school. And so there needs to be some thinking around what first, second, and third generation Muslim people, depending on their background, are going through. So even in terms of, creating the education, it needs to be targeted and it needs to be thoughtful. And it needs to really address the multiple oppressions that people are facing. Muslim communities that are in Canada are coming from, as I said, a diversity of backgrounds. And so that needs to be considered. Along with community and family education, there's a need for financial resources to be allocated towards specific Muslim programming for safe spaces, youth hotline, peer support. I know I'm preaching to the choir. You all know this. This is an ongoing issue. Imams need support from the addiction treatment community in preparing their addresses relating to Friday sermons. Most imams have limited to no training regarding substance misuse, and thus it is unrealistic to ask them to raise awareness, reduce stigma, and strengthen responses if they have no supports in doing so. I think the mainstream services here in London have a lot of responsibility towards to this, community as well as other communities. And so I'm hoping that will happen at some point. Building connections between mainstream services and the Muslim community is required, with an onus on both the Muslim community and the established addiction treatment system to reach out to each other for capacity building and cross-training activities. A critical issue for counselors, particularly those who are non-Muslim working with this population, is to be cognizant of the fundamental principles of Islam. This entails not only appreciating that Islam is a faith of peace, forgiveness, and mercy, but there is no uniform interpretation of Islam. So I think I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. We're probably all thinking the same thing. There are a few lenses that are applied to modalities and addiction services, trauma-informed approaches, maybe cultural competency, all of those sorts of things. And so we need to have probably a conversation of what that needs to look like. So I'll leave that for later, and maybe we can have a discussion together. There are a few programs and initiatives that are kind of going on in the United States and Canada. I know Maladi Islami is a 12-step program designed for Muslims, so it's similar to the traditional 12-step program, and they sort of imbue and embed Islamic faith, ideas, traditions, promises, messages, and it's been around for quite a while out of Baltimore. There's Hope, community-based organization in British Columbia. I believe they have some mental health services and addiction services within the mosque in Surrey, BC. Recently, we've got a group of really talented people out of the GTA in Toronto. Ahmed Hassan, Hiba Raghab, Arfin Malik, Zainab Abdullah, Yusra Ahmed, Nadia Sandarji, and Farah Islam, and they've created and evaluated an interactive faith-based addiction psychoeducational seminar with the aim of increasing mental health related knowledge, positive attitudes, and willingness to seek professional help among Muslims in Canada. They went to a bunch of different mosques around the GTA and they presented this, and they had some really positive feedback. I'm actually hoping that we can connect with them and do something very similar in London specifically. Limitations, there's always limitations. And so this is an exploratory study, 20 plus people, most of them were men, most of them were Arab, most of them were professional. And I mentioned, most of them were men. We have to see what, the privilege that's in the space. Most of them were Arab. There is a hierarchy of privilege, advantage, and disadvantage across the spectrum of Muslimness, of course. So there are Muslims who are Black, there are Muslims who are South Asian, and, not all of them are professional. So there's a class piece here. There's a gender piece here in terms of privilege. Muslims are a religious group, they're not a cultural group. So again, I think I've said it clearly on a few occasions, they come from a diverse background of ethnicities, cultures, ideologies, We all don't think the same, although, I think Islamophobia makes us think that we're all the same when we're really not. There are 2 billion Muslims worldwide. I gave you stats on how many there are in Canada and in London. As I said, many of them for second and third generation people coming as early as the 1700s. One thing that people don't know, and that is that Muslims across the globe, only 2% are Arab. The majority of them are non-Arab. Actually, most of them are from Indonesia and Malaysia. Majority of Muslims here in Canada are Arab, South Asian, and Black, and those numbers are very similar, meaning there's just a few thousand between them. In the United States, 20% of the Muslims living there are from Black communities, and I say communities because 30% of folks who came through slavery, so enslaved people, were Muslim. Other communities in the United States, many of them come from Sudan and Somalia and West Africa, and some from East Africa as well. Intersectionality. So Muslims experience both advantage and disadvantage across intersections of class, race, gender, sexuality, ability. We still don't know much. We've got a lot of work to do. And so it's important for us to understand this, because we understand the relationship between racism, mental wellness, and substance use, or specifically anti-Muslim racism, xenophobia, sexism, mental health issues, and substance use. Trauma-informed, new wave of trauma-informed language that has come around within the last probably 15 years in Canada. I might be wrong, maybe it's longer than that, but this is what I've seen. I'm a critical trauma theorist as well. So that means I critique trauma-informed pedagogy. I'm really interested in what trauma-informed really means. And we're told when we're working with people who are struggling that being trauma-informed means that, you're enhancing your awareness of trauma and the impact of trauma on mental health, and then, of course, the use of substance. And so some of the definitions around what trauma is, I think they define like single incident trauma, right? Something that happens like as a one-off. Complex or repetitive trauma, usually they speak about, ongoing abuse, domestic violence, war. Developmental trauma, I worked with children and families for a while with early years, actually. And we talked a lot about developmental trauma, and mostly about neglect, abuse, emotional, physical, sexual abuse, witnessing violence or death. Intergenerational trauma, describing the psychological and emotional effects that can be experienced by people who live with trauma survivors passed from one generation to the next. And then historical trauma. So that is usually describing issues related to, Indigenous genocide here in Canada, the experience of enslaved people in the United States and in Canada, by the way. And usually they connect intergenerational trauma as an aspect of historical trauma. The stats that we have are trauma among Canadians. 76% of Canadian adults report some form of trauma. And trauma, mental health, and substance use, the connection between the three, 90% of women in treatment for alcohol problems. At 5 Canadian treatment centers indicated abuse-related trauma as a child. So this is all great, and I think it's all needed. The one thing that's missing from trauma studies and in the language of trauma studies is racial trauma. I have not seen any, well, I've seen a few, there's some work that's coming out of the United States around racial trauma specifically, but even in our conceptualizations of the term trauma, when we talk about historical trauma, so, racism is not historical. Racism, that's something that occurs on a regular basis. Folks who are Black in Canada and in the United States have experienced and continue to experience ongoing trauma. Why does this matter? Well, it matters, I think, if we're going to think about how do we respond to folks from racialized backgrounds and substance use and abuse programs, or even in our own private practice, which also includes Muslim people. I think it's you may or may not know this, but there is this national summit to address issues of Islamophobia here in Canada. And we have to understand that Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism is experienced at the most intense forms at the intersection of race, so through anti-Black racism and gender. So for instance, in Alberta alone, 18 women who are Black, who wear hijab, who are female, have been attacked, have experienced violence. And most of the perpetrators are connected to white supremacist groups in that particular province. So that's another problem that we have. So when we're talking about being trauma informed, if we do not have the language that speaks to what trauma means for racialized people, many of them Muslim, then we will continue to have a problem. I think in terms of how we're going to support Muslim communities, as my point. So these are all areas of a future exploration. I hope, Rick, you ready for that? I hope you're ready for that. So I wanted to maybe open it up to folks. That was a lot all at once. Does anyone have any comments or questions or any feedback that you'd like to offer? I know it's only been a half an hour. Maybe we can spend the rest of the time chatting.
Well, Siham, I've got a few comments there because I couldn't write fast enough. No, I've actually got 3 Muslim clients, and they're police officers, and helping them navigate the system. And some of the things you're saying, I can't believe how bang on you've been, especially dealing with me. Like, look at me, I'm a white Catholic guy, and they've educated me better. But some of the challenges I find they've been having, the stigma and shame was really big right off the mark. For them to come forward was a big thing, because they were in poo. They're being disciplined because I'm the union guy with the police service there, and having them navigate with the doctors there. And one of the biggest barriers there, well, number one, the AA meetings was a really big one there, and finding Muslim, there are some what they call Muslim friendly 12-step meetings there. They didn't like that at all. But they had some unique barriers that was really tough. And one of them's still struggling there. One of them was telling me he's got a concurrent disorder, and tell me about his PTSD symptoms, and dealing with his Iman was completely different from working with a psychologist there. And so there were some challenges around that. But I just love the things that you put on there. But I see somebody else has got a hand up there, and some of the things here that some of your solutions, I know they're in one of Rick's books. I know Rick's here. There, yeah. I'm one of his students, so I got to be good here. I get my citations from him. Now you too. So, but anyways, no, this is very, very valuable information there, and it's people don't look for it. And we need a lot of CMs out there doing this stuff here. So this is great. So I don't want to take up all the time there. I'm kind of working in the back here, but I see Andrea, unmute yourself there. Go ahead there, and I'll chirp in maybe later after Rick.
Thank you. My name is Andrea De Goyas, and I'm working privately in Toronto at the Prometheum Institute. And I had lots of Muslim clients. My experience is that they choose to come here because of the stigma and shame. They did not want to go to the community. They did not want to tell to anyone. They even tell me that give me a time when nobody sees me. So the private part was like the big thing. Secondary is that when they called me and they asked me, if you send me to 12-step program, I'm not coming. I'm interested in counseling. I want to be me. I want to be seen as a human being. So because we are not 12 steps, so I didn't need it to make any exception. And my focus was always on why they used. So it's not the drug, it doesn't matter it's heroin or just alcohol. But the why was, and they were comfortable to share things with me. But I also took religious studies for my knowledge, to understand people, because what we believe is important. So it's not judgment or better or less or whatever. We live in the community when it's multi what's the word, dimensional and culturally and faith-based as well. We are very different. Just because someone is Muslim, somebody comes from I don't know, Lebanon. I'm sorry to pick you on, Siham. I hope you understand, accept it. But you know, I cannot judge you. But if I'm aware of where you come from, not only the belief part, but the country a little bit. So we have a part in that as counselors, not only knowing the addiction part and mental health part, but because we live in the country, which has so many different cultures, I think it's good to also have some studies so we understand the client beyond the existing problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So Andrew, are you saying, I think what I hear you saying is that it's important to understand where your clients are coming from and their history and their background when
That's
you're
right.
in
That's
work.
right.
Yeah. I also would like to maybe comment on that a little bit. That's also sometimes very hard because as I said, Muslims come from so many different backgrounds. So my husband's Lebanese, but I'm half Algerian and a half Palestinian, but I'm actually from Chicago. So, you know, like even when I go to the Middle East, I'm like, oh, like, I don't know if I belong
Different.
here, right? So culture is really static and it's constantly evolving. And I personally find myself living in a kind of a liminal space and in between. I'm American, I'm Canadian, and, you know, all these sorts of things. And certainly it's really interesting. It's good to get to know people and understand where they come from and their background. I am Muslim, but Muslim Islam is, offers a framework. There are certain beliefs that majority of Muslims have, but there are also that ranges as well, and it varies. So I think getting to know people individually is really, really important. Understanding their history along with their family legacy and history. Like for instance, my father is Palestinian and he experienced the catastrophe in 1948, the Nakba, where they were, you know, forcibly removed from their homes. Never able to go back, and he lived as a refugee in Jordan and then ended up going to Algeria in the 60s. You know, he was a man that didn't have a citizenship. My mother was Algerian, and so if those of you may or may not know this, but Algeria was a French colony for over 100 years. They decimated that country. And they still struggle. So all of these oppressions are really important to understand because they all inform you know, how we cope, and sometimes folks cope with substance. So it's not always just about understanding someone, you know, Islam 101 approach. It's really understanding the complexities of every human being, and again, understanding that culture is not static; it's constantly changing. But I appreciate that. Thank you.
And thank you for sharing, because that's what we need more and more, to be aware beyond the addiction part, but history and faith and so many things. So
Many things, yeah.
it's a hard profession to be in. Sorry, sometimes humor works.
It does.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
How are you?
Good, alhamdulillah. How are you?
Alhamdulillah. I very much appreciated your presentation. And I just wanted to throw out, there's also those of us who are converts.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I just wanted to hear your take on what happened in the Gaza Strip. And I think several people have come forward and stated that post-traumatic stress disorder does not even fit for those people who live there.
Yeah, so there is one specific institution, I believe it's in Ramallah. There is a psychologist that talked about ongoing stress, like it's an ongoing trauma that's occurring, specifically, you know, obviously amongst Palestinians and other populations, of course. We see Indigenous folks here in Canada struggling with ongoing trauma. and Black communities across the United States and Canada with the same. In Gaza, there have been some studies specifically on this topic, post-traumatic stress, even complex trauma. It doesn't fit with some of these populations. I work also with quite a few Syrian families, newcomers here in Canada, and this is a conversation that's ongoing. PTSD does not fit. And if you look at the history of trauma, and even in the DSM, when it was defined defined after veterans, after World War II, and then continued on with the feminists who really wanted to highlight intimate partner violence and ongoing trauma and abuse that occurs within those populations. And so there's something interesting that happens when white populations propose, and I'm going to say that very frankly, issues, problems specifically around trauma, and then you have other communities that have experienced these issues ongoingly and are not really at the table, are not offered the opportunity to give voice to what trauma actually means. So that would be my critique on trauma studies. Is that what you were referring to, sister?
Yes, it is. Yes, exactly. Yeah, I appreciate it. And I'm going to have to connect with you because we need this services down here in Windsor.
Inshallah. Yeah.
Yes, inshallah. Thank you.
Hey, unmute yourself, Liz. Go ahead.
So one of the things that I've heard over the years that to me is a very troubling stereotype is that being Muslim is a risk factor for psychosis. And I mean, my overall view of that and my experience related to the clients that I have worked with is that it seems like it's more like trauma is the underlying risk factor, not being Muslim. And I wonder if that's a stereotype that you've heard as well.
I haven't heard that specific stereotype around, as it pertains to Muslims, but I mean, as many of you are aware of scientific racism and the impact it's had on Black communities. And there was an actual diagnosis of, being Black meant that you would be, more prevalent to psychosis. So this is not an unusual thing. I think this is just a form of systemic Islamophobia. We're not the only communities that have experienced that. And so that's terrible. I've never actually heard about that, Liz. Where is this in a writing of some sort? Is this published somewhere?
No, I haven't heard that. I mean, it's comments I've heard. I work at the Royal Ottawa Mental Health Centre. So over the course of my 30 years there, it's something I've heard people say. But as I've actually worked with quite a number of people who have both psychosis and practice Muslim faith, when I talk to them, it's like, well, they've had some ridiculously traumatic experiences. And I think that's really the much more significant factor than whatever their religion is.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's some really interesting things that are coming out in the Satanism field of work. There are issues, I think, with mental health labels and the way that those labels impact racialized communities of color. We've had a few Muslim men in Canada who've been killed because mental health response by police, two specifically in Toronto within the last few years.
And Ottawa as well.
Ottawa, yeah. So there's there's certainly something going on there, and history tends to repeat itself. And I'm sure that this is an example of not just systemic racism within our institutions, but also some issues around white supremacy embedded in systems. Unfortunately, I think we all know that that's what that is. That's what I would say. I don't know if other people agree.
Thanks, Liz. Rick, I know you had your hand up there.
I know Marion had a question as well. I'm like you, Tom. I can just talk all day with Siham, so I'm not sure.
Yeah,
Marion...
I know. I don't want to take it over either. So
No, please.
Just a couple of quick comments, and then I will step aside. I had to comment on the DSM notion, and Sam and I have had this conversation. Just for you don't know, the DSM is a wonderful document. It's primarily a focus group of white male psychiatrists with pharmaceutical contracts. So just in case you're wondering who's making up issues of mental illness, that's who's doing it. So that was just a comment. The other thing I want to comment on Akeen's presentation as well on issues with the Black population addiction is during my addiction training, because we didn't have formal training, which is why I need conferences like this, is my training addiction was all colorblind. There was no issues of color and race, not even of gender in my training about addiction, because there's no one doing it. And so it's sort of happenstance and here and there. And back in the 80s and 90s, when I was counseling, it was almost an exclusively white population that I was seeing. So anyone that's trained in my generation, this is all brand new knowledge. But just on a side note about that, and I want to also touch on the fact that addiction counseling is very much a first world luxury in many ways. Not that addiction isn't an issue around the globe, we know it is. The notion is most people outside the first world don't get counseling. So we've got that privilege of being leaders in that area, which is why I appreciate Akeen and Siham coming to conference today. But the other part, and I don't know if you've seen this today, Siham, is someone actually went into a refugee camp and did a traditional depression scale. And guess what? Everyone's depressed that lives in a refugee camp. So then you move them over into this culture, you've got a cultural shock, right? And suddenly you've got now the generation issue between children. So there's so many multi-layers to intersectionality. It's just the notion of even trusting systems for newcomers who aren't used to any sort of counseling, and then gets in your second, third generation. So, I mean, this is so much layered for us in the addiction field. So there's so many things we haven't unpackaged yet that I do hope that we continue, and not just myself, other people continue to do research here, because we know far less in this field than we do in other areas of addiction.
Thank you, Rick. I even as you're talking, when you talked about globally, you know, this idea of counseling and even the term depression is conceptualized differently across cultures. When we say across Muslim cultures, many cultures, and they have their own traditional ways of responding to these types of issues. I think we need to learn a little bit more about that. I know within Islamic faith tradition or Islamic understandings around the use of alcohol, for instance, there was a slow, I wouldn't say removal, but there was at the time, Arabs 1400 years ago, alcohol was their drink of choice. And so when the faith, when the religion came about and they discussed how they didn't eradicate the drinking of alcohol completely. It was done slowly. And it was done in a way where the community needed to be strengthened first. So I think there's a lot of things that we can learn specifically from that tradition and other traditions, of course. Critical race theory, of course, you know this, Rick. So that's my focus. I would say hopefully will be my area of expertise in the next few years, is really applying critical race theory and anti-colonial theories to understanding specifically oppressions. And my hope is really to center in on racism and coloniality as being a primary issue. And for those of you who may not know much about critical race theory, it comes with this very bold statement to say that racism is endemic and it's normalized, and so is whiteness and white supremacy. And so I think that as we are moving in, doing the work that we're doing, I hope we can continue to use that lens. What do people think about race-based trauma or racial trauma as an approach, as opposed to just regular trauma approaches or trauma-informed approaches?
I think as people with white skin who are the sort of the dominant, I think it's really easy to underestimate the daily harms that are associated with racism. Mm-hmm. And I know, I had a year and a half when I was working with people who were not criminally responsible, psychotic illnesses. And it was, people living in the community. So I would be meeting with them in the community. And it was extremely obvious to me that the way in which the public interacted with me and my client was different based on what their the client's skin color was. And, you know, like, so seeing that firsthand really, like, I think until you've experienced that, it's really hard to imagine how much that must impact the psyche.
For sure. Yeah. I asked the question because it's interesting. I think I had mentioned that the majority of the folks that were in the study were Arab and they were male. And the reason why I mentioned the fact that they were Arab is they're pale-faced Arab. So even amongst Muslims, there is a hierarchy. Black Muslims in the community experience anti-Black racism on a regular basis. It's shameful, and it's true. They do. And so even the respondents that we interviewed, I don't remember any of them talking about the implications of race or gender in terms of coping or dealing with substance use and abuse and some of the, even mental health issues or issues within family or community. I don't remember any of them mentioning that. So even within our own community, we are not focusing in on the implications of racial trauma and this particular issue. It's a problem.
Go ahead, John. I mean,
I work at a treatment center in Vancouver Island, Edgewood in Nanaimo, and this is we get a lot of our clients from the community in Surrey, in BC, and I don't hear as much about racial trauma. I'll hear little snippets here and there, but I hear far more about the familial shame and the community shame within the community, because a lot of them see, and it's been put to them, that their addiction is a reflection on the family, and that's where a lot of their focus going back out into the community is, that they are now carrying this label, having been to treatment. And that's not seen as necessarily a good thing and a healthy thing, and that their families still want to keep all that secret and silent and hidden. And so their bigger struggle is nurturing their ongoing recovery.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've heard that many times, again, within my own experience with people in the community specifically. I wonder a lot about that. One of the things that comes up for me regularly in thinking about the why is that? I think about my own personal life, right? My parents came in the 60s and education was huge for us. We had to all be educated, every single one of us. We had to be successful. I remember my parents telling me, you have to work harder than every kid that's in your class because you're Arab and you just have to work harder. It's the fact of life. And you have to achieve, and you need to make a place for yourself in the United States. And now I'm in Canada. And so I wonder what that means if you add this particular issue of struggling with substance use and abuse, is showing other people and that you are a failure, or yet you are failing in life. There are these sorts of themes. So I wonder if it has something to do with immigration status. I think, yeah, I'm very curious about that. Does anybody else have any feedback or ideas about what that might be about?
I'm gonna guess that Tom says it's okay that I speak, but I don't have much to speak to it about the why, but just that I've experienced that with the clients I've worked with when I used to work residential as well.
Yeah.
Is that the inability of being able to get to some of the work they may need to do, because this first barrier was this overwhelming kind of shame. That, kind of piggybacking on what a few people have talked before, right? And it kind of begs a question for me, I guess, is now working in an outpatient setting, right? And especially with some of the statistics you spoke about before, say for example, with attendance things like AA, right? And the different kind of feelings associated. How how does an agency make itself more, like, I don't want to use the word inclusive because I think it's too general. And even the stats that go back to, even if anyone saw Dean's presentation about, the percentage that we're actually grabbing, right? Well, now that's even more so lessened. How does an agency bridge that gap, I guess, successfully, if the question makes sense?
I've been thinking about that locally. I think in the presentation I'd mentioned just capacity building and just engagement and connecting. So like in London specifically, there are like 10 organizations that are also like Muslim. So there's a Sudanese Canadian Center, there's a Pakistani Canadian Center, there's the Islamic Center, there's the Mahdi Center. There are a bunch of different places. And so just connecting with them and asking them what are some of the issues that, folks are having to deal with, and, education and awareness and some cross-pollination of knowledge, I think is really important. And I haven't seen any of that. I really haven't seen any of that, which is unfortunate. I think that's
jump in here. Yeah, I think one of the things from the study was that is that these agencies were very receptive to us as professionals reaching out to them. But again, there's that reluctance for them to come to us because it sort of demonstrates there's an issue within their community. And I mean, we've all worked in the addiction field. We know shame, it doesn't matter your culture, your race, your gender. Shame's a theme across it. But now you add this other level. And again, in terms of refugees and newcomers, there's a whole notion about, as Siham said, you've got to be successful. And this stops you from that. So there is an impetus on us. Now, the problem, of course, David and everybody else, is, we're all busy as hell, right? So we've got enough service users coming and seeing us that, hey, can you spend half a day and go visit the imam and tell them how to prepare for Friday's discussion with the faithful? I mean, but yet, right? But yet, as I said, my reason I started my presentation is everyone that came to see me was white, right? Because these communities didn't trust us as service providers back then. And so the question becomes, and those who saw Dean Anderson's presentation, how much of our responsibility is outreach to invisible communities who we know have problems, because everyone has an addiction issue, and how much is that upon us, our agencies, to say, yeah, we're going to dedicate some time to learning about these groups and making them feel welcome here, not putting the onus responsibility on them to reach out to us. So, I mean, that's a big answer, and it's going back to your agencies and your directors. But you know what, if we're going to move forward to be this inclusive, using your words you want to use, David, is his responsibility for us is to say, hey, we know that you don't feel comfortable coming to us because we don't have people that look like you, but we will listen to you. Anyway.
Can I ask a question? So I'm married, I live in Cambridge and work in Cambridge. And I think when I first started in this field, I'm going to keep dyeing my hair. So even though it looks white today, we didn't see a lot of Portuguese people coming to us for help, even though we knew that there was an issue in our community. And I worked in the downtown core because people were taking care of their own. And so they were also feeling like this shame base for people who were struggling with addiction. And it took a lot for them to kick them out of the house. And then literally they weren't allowed to go home. And so over the years, it's been, I don't know, over 25 years, we've seen more and more cultures struggling with addiction. And our problem is we don't have the resources in our community. We have a Muslim mosque. We've reached out to them. We've had a police officer who's willing to help. He's on our community team and he's been willing to come in and speak, but that also brings on shame. And so our biggest struggle is, and I think the other thing too, is some families will say, well, we're not supposed to drink, but we do drink. I think that goes like with some Christian sects as well, right? And it's like, so then they don't really understand that what an addiction actually is. So it's like, okay, you went to treatment, you're okay, just have one drink. So I think our thing too is that struggle of trying to bring the community together where they feel accepted. At the same time, it's like, how do I address people even? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, like, what is the proper etiquette for that? I think that's part of what I want to learn, is how I can treat the family so that they can understand what their family member is going through.
Yeah, it's really complicated. It depends on again, the variances of the way that you practice your faith. There are folks who are Muslim who are occasional drinkers, that they drink, they have a glass of wine with their dinner. Even though the Islamic faith, says that substance use is strictly forbidden. So there are a lot of folks who are in liminal spaces, who are struggling with that. And that certainly comes into play. The onus is on the community to open up discussions and talk about the issue, and try to destigmatize the topic, of course. And if we think about it in terms of power, a lot of these agencies have more power than a lot of these vulnerable communities. So they do have a responsibility to reach out to those vulnerable communities. And when you have an agency and the majority of people that are coming to you are from a particular background, you should ask yourself the question, why is that? And who is it that we're not serving? And why is it that they're not coming? Yes, certainly there is stigma and shame within their communities, but maybe our services are not well suited to these other people that are living within our communities as well.
Yes, Sam, there's a few people had their hands up and down there. Andrea, I see yours is up again there, but I want to give Ashley a chance. She had hers up and down, and I know she's dying to go on. So unmute there, Ashley, go ahead. And
I just want to say thank you so much for bringing this presentation and giving this opportunity. I am Indigenous, and I am recently new into the addictions and mental health community. But I also have the opportunity because I'm mixed, and I was not raised on reserve, but I had the experience of receiving the poor treatment and stigma and shame of being associated with the white population. And it's very true for a lot of minority immigrant populations within Canada. And it's something that we don't really consider. And family is huge on the recovery. And I think only providing better education, like you said, and getting the community involved is a step in the right direction. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you. And again, I want to reiterate, this is, Muslim issues, it's a big word, and I can't speak on behalf of all of the Muslims in the world, or even the Muslims in the city of London, 30,000. Sorry, I'm just looking at the chat. There are people who internalize Islamic faith traditions differently than others. And as I said earlier, Islam is a faith of peace. We're supposed to support folks who are in our community that are suffering, and moments of weakness. It's completely normalized in the Islamic faith. We've got lots of verses in the Quran that talk about human beings. There's one particular ayah that says, that means a human being is born anxious. A human being is born vulnerable. Human being will be vulnerable. And so understanding that vulnerability occurs throughout a lifetime. There's another verse that says, Inna ma'al usri yusra, inna ma'al usri yusra. That means verily with hardship comes ease. Verily with hardship comes ease. They say it in the ayah 3 times to reiterate that there is always going to be hardship and ease. And I think the reason why it's important for us to highlight the fact that not all Muslims understand their faith, really understand their faith completely. It's probably our responsibility to really, as part of, addressing the stigma of mental health and substance use, by sending the message that it's something that's going to happen to you inevitably. It's completely normal. It's not something you should be ashamed of. It doesn't mean that you're weak, because human beings are ultimately weak at some point in their life, and sometimes they're really, really strong. So I hope that we can continue to work with the Muslim community, communities across London specifically, in being able to deliver this message so that we can alleviate the stigma, but also in partnership with other folks who have the power and the resources to assist our communities, because they really are suffering. They really, really are suffering. as many communities are. Again, Muslims, Christians, very big population from a lot of different backgrounds, immigration statuses. We've got quite a few actually, newcomers who are really struggling with substance use, and they have nowhere to go. They really have nowhere to go. So let me see.
That's great. Andrea, you still had your hand up there. Did you have another point? Go ahead.
Yes, I would like just to share. I just would like to make awareness, and please don't think that I'm judging anyone. But sometimes as professionals, we can use labels. You are an addict, you are this, you are that, because we are coming from a very different understanding. The person who is in front of us, I call it a client, comes from a faith and a culture when there is no drinking and no drugging. So coming from that angle, it's already the person has double shame. So as a counselor, I need to be very careful and assess the person where this substance abuse can be experimental, because coming from that nothing, you don't use anything, you don't drink anything, and going to the extreme, like want to fit in, have a Western friends, go to the parties, and within a very short period of time, the person can be in trouble. But it doesn't mean that the full-blown addict. But we as counselors may say that, addiction is an addiction and you are this, you are that. So we need to be very careful as well, because we may not help the person to label. So we talk about stigma. We can also need to be very careful and personalize the treatment, even if they are in group and they are in residential setting and whatnot. Easy for me because I work one-on-one, and I'm very aware of that. And I when I'm explaining what is addiction, I try not to label. I said, where are you in this experimenting, use, misuse, abuse, and addiction, and work with the person rather than I'm labeling. Thank you. Thank you for understanding where I'm coming from.
Totally. I've got a few clients that I'm currently working with that are, again, I've said liminal spaces, right? Second generation, parents are from overseas, they're born and raised here. They're occasional, they drink occasionally, they smoke marijuana occasionally. I'm coming up against a lot of difficulty around identity, finding their place in the world, not knowing whether they're Muslim enough, not knowing whether they're Canadian enough, not knowing where they fit. And so I think you're right in terms of how to respond to clients when you're in private practice like we are. You're really needing to, to meet the client where they're at. And that sometimes requires me to answer questions. I'm not a theologian. I'm a Muslim. I'm someone who practices. I read a lot. I can tell people what I know just based on my own lens, and that's what Islam is about. You put your glasses on and you read the holy book, and then you kind of think about what that means for you in your own context. I'm having a lot of conversations like these. If I drink on occasionally, does that still mean I'm a Muslim? So it's certainly a complex issue. It's a difficult thing to have a discussion about, but every person is unique and they internalize their faith differently. That's definitely something that I know. And Rick, you used to hear me say that in BSW and MSW courses, everyone internalizes their faith differently.
That's a very good point there, Sam. One of the other points there, like I'm in the Toronto area, very multicultural area. And for people who are at the other end, we're making the referrals to the treatment centers and to the people in private practice. The challenge for us is finding the right resource and finding out what works for your client, because it is individualized there. Because, I'm thinking back, and Rick will laugh at this. I remember watching a Father Martin tape they used to show in the, Rick's laughing. So Father Martin was a Roman Catholic priest, and he gave his he was a very motivational speaker, very well spoken, but he talked about the difference between the Muslim and the Jewish faith and the rate of addiction, and how it was so different because alcohol is forbidden in one and alcohol was allowed in the other, but the addiction rate was the opposite what you would think. But one thing I took from that, and from learning from Rick, was that really addiction, mental health, concurrent disorders, trauma there, it doesn't care what the color of your skin is. It doesn't care what your religion is and that. But when it's getting the people the help they need, you have to be very mindful if you want to maximize their recovery. And I think that's the challenge across the board.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the Vice documentary in Dearborn. There's a really lovely program of folks who are recovering. There's a treatment center specifically, and they part of recovery is they take people to do their pilgrimage at Hajj, and it's been really effective. Again, take a look at that opioid epidemic Vice video. You can Google it, you'll be able to find it. And, there seems to be some positive, the implications for injecting faith and faith directives in recovery. We know that the evidence shows that that is certainly the case in other populations. So faith can be a protective factor, certainly, but it can also be pretty harmful. So I think whether you're Muslim, you're Jewish, or you're Christian, you're balancing that sort of thing constantly. Yeah.
I know we're kind of winding down here, but we do have some time for anybody else that wants to pitch in, have any comments or any other questions, because for me, this is a privilege having you here, Sam. I've written down a lot of stuff there, and I'm going to get some more information off of Rick, maybe for some future stuff with some clients I'm dealing with now with Muslim faith. Does anybody else have any other comments, suggestions, or any questions at this time?
I'll just pipe in. I just appreciate this opportunity to hear from a Muslim perspective about addiction. I've wondered about it. I'm a recovering Catholic, and it was called a Catholic disease, and there's a lot of control issues.
Yeah.
And I see the same. I've wondered about the same thing with the Muslims, how controlling and rigid the religion is, and how that can set us up for addiction as well. So that's kind of what I was thinking as I was sitting here.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. I think that is a problem across the board for most faiths. It's hard for me to, I don't really not sure how I can, respond to that. Like, I mean, we see certain countries that are very rigid in the way that they teach the rule. I mean, Saudi Arabia, there's a perfect example. That is not a really good example of, although it's calls itself an Islamic state, many of its rules, regulations are actually antithetical, like kind of opposite to Islam and Islamic teaching. So again, there are people who are in power and control positions in populations and communities, amongst Muslim communities. In the Catholic faith, there's this white male status that, I think needs to be discussed when we talk about power in faith communities. We also have the same issue. I can't give you a response and say that, yes, this is an issue. Probably it is an issue. I've never experienced that personally, although I have friends who have experienced that. That's a difficult conversation. I'm not sure that I can give you a generalized response, but what I will say is that we have that problem, like other faith groups have that problem. Although one of the most important Islamic faith components is the acquisition of knowledge and critical reflection. So our faith is not a blind faith. So we're told that we're not supposed to plan and live our lives based on what our parents tell us or what the imam tells us to do. We are supposed to acquire knowledge and apply our faith perspectives contextually. So if you have a faith ruling, you take it and you apply it to the context in which you live in and see whether that makes sense. So it is a faith that requires, again, critical reflection and engagement and understanding. That's not always practice. That's not always true. Again, like I said, you look at Saudi, they don't allow women to drive. I mean, there were no cars 1400 years ago. Who decided that women couldn't drive? That doesn't make any sense. That sounds like sexism. And so a lot of us have to deal with that. Sexism is a problem across the board. Power is a problem across the board. And so many communities are struggling with that as well. I hope that was again, I'm not a theologian, but I am a critical race theorist, and I do a lot of I try to do a lot of analysis on power, and power is certainly a problem.
And I think
Great
we
answer.
have one more question here. Oh, we've got more questions coming up there. Let's go ahead, John.
Not really a question. It's really, I really am glad we're having this discussion. I think this has been made into a very safe and open discussion here today, and I really appreciated it. Taking a lot out of it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, John. Thank
Akin, you had your hand up there.
No, I actually just clapped for her for the last point she made.
Thank you, brother. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Maybe we'll wrap things up. I'm not sure who won. I don't want to know. Don't tell me who won. Don't tell me who won. If the soccer game is over or not. I heard some screams, but anyway, I appreciate the time and the space. I really do hope that the Creator gives me strength to continue on. This is a very important topic. I'm very thankful for Rick, your mentorship, your friendship. Akin, your mentorship, your friendship, and I appreciate everyone so very much. Take good care and enjoy the rest of your day. I know it was long.
Thank you.
Bye.
I'll let you sign out there, Siham. That will close it down for us. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks so much. Bye-bye.